Tilea's Troubles, Part 113. We Know Our Business. The Fight at Sersale, A Battle Report. Part 1. Late Spring, 2404. As the village of Sersale came into view, Admiral Volker could see that this time the Alcentians had chosen to mount a proper defence. There had been squabbles at Mintopua and Matola, and a handful of his scallywags had died. But for whatever reason, the defenders failed to muster any real strength to oppose them. His captains were convinced this was because there was no strength to muster, which was the Sartosan's reason for targeting this particular realm in the first place. They knew the Alcentian marching army, mainly composed of the VMC's foreign mercenaries, had gone north to join Lord Alessio Falcone's struggle against the vampires. Although, as they had stopped to argue with the Duke of Pavona along the way, they were apparently in no hurry to reach that war. "Maybe," Captain Van Bass had joked, when discussing how easy the plundering had been, "they ain't in a hurry to return either." Considering the wealth of the company's newly acquired possessions in and around Alcente, Volker could only assume the VMC's army was simply too far away to return quickly. Yet if the company had been prepared to dispatch its army so far, surely it would have left something behind to defend its precious new possession, its Tilean milch cow. Thus it was no real surprise to discover that here, at Sersale, there were not just hastily mustered militiamen and light horse, but regimented bodies of soldiers, one of which being well armoured. As far as Volker could ascertain, the enemy was still too weak a force to thwart his own army, but there could be some trickery at play. Perhaps a relief force was on its way, and Alcentians were defending this place rather than their city walls, to buy time. If so, what were they waiting for, and how soon would it arrive? Or were they simply unwilling to allow any further destruction of their property? The enemy possessed only one piece of ordnance, compared to Volker's 3. He decided he would command his own artillery to deal with it first. 2 of the regiments bore Alcente city standards, checkered red and white bands on a field of blue, with black crenellations presumably to represent the city walls. These must be the city's drilled militia, no doubt possessing some skill in their halberds and crossbows. A large body of well-armoured soldiers bore the orange and blue colours of the VMC itself, most likely professional mercenary soldiers bought with the ample funds available to such a rich trading company. As he had suspected, their presence revealed that not every professional mercenary had marched north. These men-at-arms could be trouble, as could the mounted pistoliers carrying the same colours. Then there was a large body of lightly armoured swordsmen, rivalling the men-at-arms in size, but lacking a standard. These were probably the local militia, but as such they could not be discounted as a threat. Being so close to the Black Gulf, even the part-time soldiers of this region were likely to know how to handle a blade. And if this was indeed their home, then they had no need of a standard to inspire them to fight. The village itself was flanked by a river, crossed by a stout stone bridge. Several large dwellings were surrounded by small enclosed fields and orchards, making the place fairly defensible, even without further work. No bad thing then, thought Volker, that this time he had brought his entire strength to bear. A week or so before, at Matola, he had sent Captain Van Bass and his crew to take and raise the village, while he and the rest of his army waited close by to lend support if required, and, if necessary, to counterattack any relief force dispatched from the city, which was exactly what had happened, and several many VMC horsemen had perished in their abortive attempt to relieve the village. Here, today, their efforts to relieve the locals were considerably more substantial. Volker and his 3 surviving captains had marshalled their crews. As both his crew and Captain Van Bass's were badly mauled in the earlier fights, upon drawing close to the village, he commanded them to amalgamate into one body, all the better to apply strength of numbers in any fight they took on. Captain Van Bass did not complain. Indeed, he seemed relieved. Maybe his crew had been mutinously grumbling about their losses, and this strengthening would reassure them. Volker's army was heavily reliant on black powder, for as well as the 3 pieces of ordnance, he had 2 companies of handgunners, another of blunderbusses, and 2 armed with swivels. Captain Fark's goblins also favoured powder, being festooned with pistols, but, unlike the dwarfs, who were bereft of their captain, Bruax, since the battle near Lucini. Their pieces were somewhat ill-kept and unreliable. Such was the way of goblins. Volker often angrily wished it was not also the way of several of his own crewmen. But it was not the place of a pirate captain to apply the lash, rather to persuade with promises of wealth gained and inspire by example. The ship's articles also played a role, and indeed it was stipulated in the 7th clause of his own such rules, voted for by a majority, that all the crew were to keep their weapons free of rust, well-oiled and ready for battle. Recent transgressions, however, had led to a pettifogging debate concerning whether the articles applied on land, and he had been too distracted by his duties as army commander to settle the matter in the usual manner. His recently raised but already weakened pike regiment was intended to add a better defence against enemy horse soldiers, and his 2 wizards, Arcabar and Vidus, were there not just to dish out magical harm, but to counter whatever spells the enemy might conjure. Right now, however, it seemed the only horse soldiers the enemy possessed were on the wrong side of the river, and Arcabar had mentioned that he could not sense the presence of any wizards in the village. Still, thought Volker, better to be safe than sorry. More horse could come, and any wizards might be concealed, biding their time before they struck. The defenders had deployed mostly within the confines of the village boundary, except for the Pistoleers upon the far side of the river. Volker had sent no one that way, having failed to find a ford to cross, but he was not concerned, reckoning his lads would make short work of them, the river notwithstanding. The horsemen would surely learn the folly of prancing about within range of his pieces. A few archers were lurking among the trees of the stone-walled orchard, like brigands awaiting the passage of prey, while the city militia crossbows manned a hastily made barricade of ladders and planks between the orchard and the hedged field. The enemy's largest regiments waited behind, on the villagers' streets, obviously hoping to thwart his army's advantage in numbers by fighting within a restricted space. What use was 100 men if only those 6 at the front could bring their weapons to bear? Volker knew from ship-to-ship fighting that with such restricted access even 10 men could hold back 100, if they were bold or desperate enough. The enemy's single gun was out on their far right flank, concealed behind a hedge, and well sighted so that it could aim its muzzle at almost any part of Volker's army. It was heavier than his own pieces, but this was a fight for field pieces, not great guns, and so he was not too concerned. Volker intended to bring the full strength of his own army to bear, and in so doing present such a sight as to strike fear into the outnumbered enemy, which is why he commanded his army to array in one long line of battle. Such a deployment would also enable his guns, both big and small, to play at the foe unhindered. So it was that he put his ordnance, swivels and handguns upon both flanks, while his 3 large fighting companies, being the pike, Fark's goblins, and his and Van Bassa's conjoined crews, occupied the centre. His dwarves were out on the left, to ensure that flank and the baggage were protected by something that could fight hand to hand and hard. Out on the right was the river, in full flow due to the season, so he was not worried about that side. Only the foolish or the desperate would attempt to cross it, and they would fail. Besides, if the Pistoleers thought they could harry his troops from the far side of the river, his right flank could still present quite a challenge, what with a body of swivel gunners ensconced in the trees and 2 companies of handgunners flanking them. It would be interesting to see how pistols fared against their larger cousins. As well as the dwarfs on the left, he had placed 2 of his artillery pieces and his own blunderbuss-armed crewmen, including Dradger, the great orc, and his mighty firearm, Mine. Volker had seen what Mine could do. It was colourful, if not exactly pretty. Behind them was the baggage, and although the wagons, carts and mules carried much of the loot so far stolen, a considerable fortune, Volker was not too worried about the enemy attempting its capture, for they would surely be far too busy defending what they already had to bother with trying to take more. Still, it comforted him to know that the dwarfs were close by to keep an eye on it. He himself personally commanded the joint regiment of his own and Van Bassa's mariners. His yellow-shirted navigator, Ubaida el-Nur, stood to one side of him, and on the other was his standard-bearer, carrying his colours of a death's head above a cutlass. Next stood Van Bassa's boatswain, Mukib Brahimi, then the wizard Adus Arkabar, and on the far left Van Bass and his own standard-bearer. Crab, the young lad who carried the drum, had been relegated to the second rank for want of space amongst the officers and sea artists at the fore. Vidus, the other wizard, was marching with the pikes, whilst Captain Jamar Garik was commanding his handgunners on the right. Volker was glad that Jamar was out there to keep an eye on things. The fellow had proved himself competent many times over, and a safe pair of hands. Volker's booming voice, a startling sound to issue from so slight a man, signalled the advance, and the Sartosans began to close upon the village. They kept in step, for now, with the dwarves, maintaining a straight line and so ensuring plenty of unobscured targets for the artillery, big and small. The 3 central regiments fair bristled with steel, neither sword blades, pistol barrels or pike heads, and made a sight to see as they moved as one. Volker knew full well that Captain Fark's horde of goblins on his right were pretty much all show and little substance, but to the enemy they would still look frighteningly numerous. Quieter, so that only the men near him could hear, Volker declared, "That's good, lads, steady and neat. Let's show 'em we know our business." He wondered what it must be like to be in the village looking out, to see an entire army of renowned robbers closing in, an enemy that had already devoured the western reaches of the realm, and was clearly intent on continuing its feast. Would the sight sow fear or resolve? No matter, he thought, we'll find out soon enough. He could hear Fark shrill shouting as he too ordered his mob onwards. The goblin captain had spent the previous night bragging how he and his lads would surely get to grips with the enemy before anyone else, leaving little work for the rest of the army. Fark then attempted to convince the other captains they should therefore give him and his lads a reward in advance, indeed immediately, considering how some of his lads would be dead after the battle, and so, unfairly, would not be able to enjoy said reward. Volker probably spent too long trying to work out if the goblin captain was joking or in earnest. Either way could mean trouble, as goblin humour invariably involved inflicting suffering upon some poor unfortunate, even one of their own, while an aggrieved goblin was as likely as any Sartosan to seek vengeance. Volker would have to keep an eye on him. Goblins were renowned for having more cunning than orcs, and such could make Fark dangerous, even to those who believed him to be their friend or follower. Of more immediate concern to Volker was his chief wizard, Arkabar, for the man was on the wrong side of old for a battle, being toothless and wizened, despite his obvious ability to weave formidable conjurations. The previous night, Arkabar had reassured him that if he was strong enough to survive the flip they were drinking, a heady mixture of rum, beer and sugar heated up with a red-hot poker, then he was strong enough for battle. When Volker had asked the wizard if he was alive that morning, Arkabar had belched before opening his eyes, asking, "Can the dead do that?" Now, as they advanced, Arkabar proved he was indeed strong enough to hurt the foe, for he conjured up a magical shower of lightning bolts to hurl towards the crossbowmen at the enemy's front and centre, cowering behind their makeshift barricade. 3 of the crossbowmen fell, one screaming horribly, the other 2 deathly silent as their blackened bodies crumpled. Volker could also see several balls of fire arcing towards the archers concealed in the orchard, undoubtedly invoked by Vidus, but, unlike Arkabar's blue bolts, they dissipated before they reached the enemy. Arkabar himself did not seem to notice his fellow wizard's failure, busy as he was with killing 2 more of the crossbowmen with yet another spell, this time causing a sheet of fire to burst from the very ground they stood upon. Just as Volker wondered what the guns were up to, he heard the rippling sound of shots, loud and louder from all along the line. Impressive, he thought, as the gun on his right sent chain shot into the already mauled crossbowmen, killing 3 more. The militiamen, half their number either badly charred or torn to pieces, with hardly a moment having passed since the Sartosans began their advance, could take no more and fled from the barrier. "Fare thee well," shouted some wit from the ranks behind. A moment later there came another boom, this time louder, followed by the sound of shouting from his own lines. One of the brace of pieces to his left had blown up. Volker didn't know it, but the other had failed to fire altogether. Its crew were not bitter, however, considering what they had just witnessed. They were just thankful to be alive. As the enemy's mounted pistoliers cantered forwards, a swivel found its mark and tore one of them from his saddle. The rest, however, closed in on the handgunners on the far flank. The volley of pistol fire proved surprisingly accurate, as they killed 5 of the 9 pirates. Luckily for the rest of the Sartosans, their success was not equalled by the Alcentian ordnance on the other far flank. The gunners lined their muzzle up on the surviving Sartosan gun facing them, but their shot merely clipped the piece as it passed harmlessly through the shaken crew. Father Vittorio, the Morite priest serving Sersale and several surrounding villages, seeing the militia sergeant Ivo bravely rallying his battered crossbowmen despite their recent mauling, thought to help them with a blessing of protection, but found his prayer thwarted by the enemy's wizards. It seemed his prayers were not going to be strong enough, not with such powerful magic users in opposition. Despite the doubt he suddenly felt concerning the defence of his parish, Vittorio's courage was not diminished. Neither he nor the Sersalian militia swordsmen he led intended to depart the village. Live or die, either way, they would stay. Admiral Volker did not need to command his army to continue the advance, as everyone knew to do so. The enemy stood their ground, apparently satisfied with their deployment. He would be too, if he were one of them, thought Volker, for despite the basic and limited nature of their defences, they had used them well. Volker shouted across to Arkabar, pointing towards the archers lurking in the orchard. Arkabar nodded and lifted his staff to signal to Vidas further down the line, advancing with the pikemen. Vidas did not really need the encouragement, for they had been the target of his last spell. Forcing himself to ignore the blaring horn being sounded beside him, he fixed his eyes on the archers and once again began an incantation. This time twice as many flaming orbs coalesced from the ether, already in motion as they rent their way into the material realm to course at speed towards the trees, trailing blue sparks. Upon hitting the branches, they spewed sheets of fizzling flames which rained down on the men cowering behind the stone wall below, incapacitating half a dozen and causing the remaining handful to leap, smoking and screaming, over the rear wall and through the men-at-arms on the other side. They only stopped when they reached the building over the street. As he squinted to look through the smoke and ascertain how well he had done, Vidas suddenly noticed a coiling eddy of excess magical energy coalescing above him, at the very spot where the fireballs had crossed the seam dividing the realms. He had badly misjudged the etheric force drawn into his spell, and clearly failed to control even half of it. His squint turned into a wince, less than a second before the broiling energy folded itself inside out to explode with an exponentially magnified power, and yet no sound at all. The blast sucked the very air from his lungs, and he struggled to stay upon his feet. When he finally managed to draw a choking breath, his throat blazed with pain at the heat of it. Opening the one eye he could, he saw that many more than half the men he had been marching with had fallen to the ground, lifeless or senseless, whilst those few still on their feet, like himself, reeled and wheezed in shock. The blast's soundlessness meant that Volker noticed the horror on Arkabar's face before he spotted the confusion amongst the pike. Upon first glance, other than the smoke that had coalesced about them, which he presumed was from one of the guns nearby, it appeared the company had stumbled onto a patch of potholes and so taken a tumble. For a moment he entertained the thought that the enemy might have dug pit traps around the village, but then the look on Arkabar's face made it obvious that something more serious had happened. When Arkabar spat out the words, "Feed us, you fool!" Volker knew the other wizard was somehow to blame. First the cannon, now Vidas. It seemed neither powder nor magic were to be relied on today. Yet the next few moments suggested that powder, with which his army was plentifully supplied, could still contribute to their success. First, an iron round shot punched through the hedge before the enemy's gun to smash into the gun itself, disabling it and badly wounding its crew. Then the surviving 4 handgunners out by the river, their comrades lying dead or dying around them, fired their pieces to throw 3 more pistoliers from their saddles. The horsemen turned around to gallop away somewhat quicker than they had come. Not quick enough to outrun the shots of the swivel gunners in the trees, though. Not wanting to miss out on the sport, the swivels also fired, and another 3 horsemen died. This only hastened the few surviving pistoliers' frantic retreat. The swivel gunners now found themselves somewhat at a loss, for with the only enemy they could see galloping away, it seemed there might be little else for them to do. "Wait!" shouted one of them in jest towards the last of the pistoliers. "Come back! We've still got powder!" The cannon on the Sartosan's right fired chain shot into the halberdiers in the village, tearing 3 of them in half. Fearing that Sergeant Ivo's recently rallied crossbowmen might once again falter at the sight and sound of this, Father Vittorio now ran ahead to join them at the barricade. There he prayed that Moore would curse the wizard in white, and indeed could sense his God's will manifesting through him. But his momentary hope was dashed as the enemy's counter-magic proved too strong. Disheartened, he found himself surprised by the sudden snaps of the crossbows as they brought down 4 of the goblins now charging at them. There were so many goblins, though, that it was doubtful the rest had even noticed, and the next moment Vittorio found himself suddenly close to the green-skinned mob. Volker had begun to order his own regiment to charge the crossbows, but had faltered as Fark's mob hurtled by, blocking the way. When he spied the 4 trampled goblins left in their wake, quarrels piercing their corpses, he found it quite easy to console himself at the lost opportunity. Better them than my boys, he thought. Still, knowing the goblins, his boys might yet have to do the real work. Fark's boast of the previous night, that he and his lads would get stuck in first, might well have proved true, but that did not mean they would stay stuck in. Arkabar, having apparently spotted the damage done to the halberdiers by the chain shop, was obviously intent on seeing what he could do to further their misery. He conjured up a shower of burning blue bolts to equal the cannon's tally. The halberdiers, however, were apparently made of strong stuff, for they took this as they had taken the chain shot and stood their ground. Vidas and his shattered pikemen were now very close to the men-at-arms, but their will had been sapped, and they came to a halt. Right now, the prospect of ditching their pikes to cross 2 stone walls and assail the armoured professionals massed upon the other side seemed insane. Apparently, the men-at-arms understood the pike were no longer a threat, for not a one of them even glanced at Vidas and his comrades, intent instead on watching the crossbow fight against the goblins up ahead. One of the pikemen was shouting something about going around the orchard, but what with the resumption of the horn's incessant blaring and the continued confusion of his thoughts since his dreadful miscasting, Vidas failed to respond either by word or deed. While the handgunners and swivels fired yet more bullets at the broken pistoliers, killing all but one, and the 2 remaining pieces of ordnance shot chain to fell a handful of halberdiers as well as some of the men-at-arms, Captain Fark and his horde fought the crossbowmen at the barricade. Several goblins died as their shoddily maintained pistols blew apart, while Bagman Fark himself malingered in the second rank, trying to look busy without committing himself to any real fighting. It was a bitter fight, and despite the fact that the casualties were pretty much even, the weight of numbers was on the goblin side. Father Vittorio and the crossbowmen, no longer numerous enough to defend every part of the barricade, broke, to be cut down almost immediately by their whooping and baying foe. The sheer press of their numbers meant the goblins burst right over the barricade, and, within a moment, had slammed into Captain Hector Perdigon's men-at-arms, who were calmly awaiting their arrival.